Is Robert John Mutt Lang responsible for the success of the band AC/DC? That's the question I'm going to pose in this video because I want to talk about the album Highway to Hell, which is the sixth studio album by AC/DC, released on July 27, 1979, and celebrating 45 years. Also the first of 3 albums produced by Mutt Lang. I want to tell the story of how the band went through struggles, had difficulty with their record company, had to go through a few producers. They had to say goodbye to one producer who was actually part of the family, of which they were very reluctant to do so. But in the end, they had the breakout album of their career, and it opened doors to new fans on a worldwide level. The album also faced some controversy related to a serial killer and later a tragedy. I will be talking about all of that in this video. The story begins in the year 1978. AC/DC had already released 5 albums, but were mostly popular only in Australia and Europe. They weren't very well known in the United States at this point in time, but their albums were successful mostly in Australia. The albums were also very good albums, possibly some of their best. I'm talking about 1976's Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, 1977's Let There Be Rock, and 1978's Powerage. But they still couldn't reach an American audience. Even the American branch of Atlantic Records rejected the 1976 album Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, which would be released about a year later, but that's a whole different story. One thing that all these Australian albums have in common was that they were produced by George Young, who is the older brother of Malcolm and Angus Young, as well as Harry Vanda, who was in a rock band with George called the Easy Beats. And this was back in the 60s. But here's the problem. Atlantic Records was unhappy with their albums. So they wanted them to make an album that would be accepted by an American audience. So they suggested getting a producer who could help them get a more radio-friendly sound. At first, Malcolm and Angus were not happy with this because they felt it was a betrayal to their older brother George. But the record company insisted, and the band started working with a producer whose name was Eddie Kramer. Now, Eddie Kramer was an experienced producer who had worked with a lot of artists such as Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and Kiss, but the band did not get along. I read a quote from Malcolm Young that says, Kramer was a bit of a prat. And what's funny, I didn't even know what that word meant, because I guess as an American I never heard it before, but it basically means like an idiot, if you know, but supposedly it's slang in England and Australia. But back to the story. They're really butting heads with this guy. They're trying to work with him in a studio in Miami, Florida, and Eddie Kramer wants them to do a cover song of Give Me Some Lovin' by the Spencer Davis Group, but they're not happy. So the record company gets another producer, and that is Robert John Mutt Lang, who was known for producing the Boomtown Rats, but they decided to start working together again. They also had a new manager. They fired their current manager, Michael Browning, and hired a new guy named Peter Mensch, who was someone who had worked with both Aerosmith and Ted Nugent. So now they're getting ready to record again. They went back to London and they worked very long days, as long as 15 hours a day for over 2 months. For some reason, Mutt Lang really clicked with the band. He was a hard worker and he was very demanding. He was meticulous. He wanted the guitars and drums to sound perfect, and even Bon Scott was impressed of how he got his voice to sound. Mutt Lang was very patient with Bon Scott. He did breathing exercises with him, and it worked because we all know Bon Scott was not that easy to work with. I'll talk more about him later. Not only that, but Angus Young was someone who benefited from working with Lang. Angus was somebody who was not easy to work with either, but Lang was very patient, and he just sat next to him and guided him, playing his solos until they got it perfect. Now they had some songs that were ready, the most famous one being the title track Highway to Hell, which was inspired from being on the road where they spent all this time on a tour bus, and they were all crammed together, so they called it the Highway to Hell. But a lot of the other songs were written by Bon Scott, and a lot of them were filled with sexual innuendos such as Love Hungry Man, Girls Got Rhythm, Beating Around the Bush, Touch Too Much, and Walk All Over You, and other songs about partying and the rock and roll lifestyle, such as Get It Hot and Shot Down in Flames. There was one song that was the center of controversy, but it didn't happen until about 5 or 6 years later. I'm talking about the song Night Prowler, one of the slower, bluesier songs. It was controversial because it became associated with a serial killer in the mid-'80s named Richard Ramirez, who killed more than 15 people, and his nickname was the Night Stalker. But it was known that this guy, Richard Ramirez, was a big fan of the song Night Prowler. There was even one time when he left an AC/DC hat and was wearing an AC/DC shirt at one of the crime scenes. And there was one point when Richard Ramirez shouted, "Hail Satan," during the trial, and that caused a lot of controversy. You can see it here in the People magazine cover that it was kind of a big deal because, keep in mind, it was the mid-'80s, right in the middle of the satanic panic, and even though by today's standards, nobody considers AC/DC to be a satanic band, but back then things were a little different. So now it's time to release the album. It was released in Australia through Albert Productions and licensed to Atlantic Records for the worldwide release. The original Australian album cover was a little different, as you can see right here. Features the original cover, but with flames and a guitar neck, which kind of reminds me of the game Guitar Hero. And the cover that we all know, what was released, the international cover, that's this one here. So the album was successful. It became AC/DC's first album to break the top 100 on the US Billboard chart, peaked at number 17. It's also their second highest selling album after Back in Black, which was the big breakout. I'll be doing a video of that at some point, probably next year for its anniversary. But this album opened a lot of doors. The critics loved it, and I believe it's one of their best albums. I usually go back and forth between this one and Back in Black being the best. Despite the success, the band faced tragedy on February 19th, 1980. It was interesting because Bon Scott was preparing the next album called Back in Black. A few days before his death, Bon Scott was working with Malcolm and Angus on some new songs that would eventually be on Back in Black, which were Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You. And it was funny that Bon Scott was actually playing the drums at this point. But speaking of drinking, Angus Young, he never drank alcohol in his life, and you could see in this photo here, he has a jug of milk, so I thought that was interesting. But tragically, a few days later, on the early morning of February 19, 1980, Bon Scott died at the age of 33. He died in his sleep, and according to official report of the coroner, he died of acute alcohol poisoning. Bon Scott was never able to fight his demons, which were alcohol and other drugs, but he lived long enough to make one more great album with the band. I'm talking about this one, Highway to Hell. So now, to answer the question I posed, was Mutt Lang responsible for their success? I mean, let's imagine if they had stayed with George Young to produce the album. Would it still have been successful, or would they just have remained a band that was just popular in Australia, but not worldwide superstars? I'm talking about something along the lines of a band like Rose Tattoo, which were a great rock band, but they never reached that superstardom. I think, this is just my opinion, of course, without Mutt Lang, they might have ended up just like that band, and probably Bon Scott would have still eventually died anyway because of his lifestyle. So I believe without the success of Highway to Hell, they may have never become worldwide superstars. We don't know. It's all speculation. You can let me know in the comments if you disagree. You can just write a long paragraph if you think I'm wrong. I don't mind. But in the meantime, check out this playlist of other AC/DC reviews I've done in the past. I've done plenty of them. Thanks for watching. Please like this video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. You can find me on Facebook and TikTok. Links in the video description. And I will see you in the next one.